Hey guys,
E aí, pessoal?
Hola!
we are back. I'm Gavin and I'm with Glauber from Brazil and Tatelli from Mexico, and we are going to talk about Portuguese grammar today as it relates to Spanish grammar, and hopefully give you a brief introduction of 11 little concepts you might want to check out if you're trying to learn Portuguese from Spanish. This is by no means going to be a complete overview, complete grammatical lesson of each of these. Rather, it's just a quick introduction to something that you're going to have to think about and investigate a little more on your own when you're learning the language. So I've divided these into 11 little subjects, and here we go. Number one is that in Portuguese, and I imagine that when I make this video, I'll put a little conjugation chart on the screen for you here. You typically lose completely the tu sense, and you use você instead for tu. So an example of a sentence with that, and I'm going to have Glauber read the Portuguese phrase followed by Zitelli in Spanish, and then myself in English, so you can get an idea of this here. But so you'll typically use você and conjugate it in the third person singular instead of using tu in the second person singular.
Você vai ao supermercado?
¿Vas al supermercado?
And then another one.
Como você está?
¿Cómo estás?
One thing that you gain, though, in this conjugation chart that you can see is the tense, or the personal pronoun a gente, which means we, and is used interchangeably with nos, right? But it's conjugated also in the first person, or in the third person singular. And so an example of that is...
A gente é americano.
Somos americanos.
We are American.
A gente foi ao cinema.
Fuimos al cine.
We went to the movies, or to the theater. Number two is that there's much less dropping of the subject pronoun in Portuguese. If you see on this graph here, typically in English and French, for example, you always have to say the subject pronoun before the verb. So I am, she is, we went, he went, they went. You always have to use that subject pronoun. The exact opposite side of the spectrum is in Italian and Latin, where the verb automatically implies what the subject pronoun is, and you never have to add it. If you've learned Spanish from English, you know that you rarely use the subject pronoun. Typically when you conjugate the verb, you know who you're talking about. Como, comes, comen, come. It's more or less implied. Brazilian Portuguese kind of sits in between English and Spanish in terms of having to use the subject pronoun. You'll definitely, if you're learning Portuguese, hear it a lot more than you would from a native Portuguese speaker than from a Spanish speaker. So a few quick examples of this.
Você viu esse filme?
¿Viste esa película?
Did you see that movie?
Eu me sinto bem.
Me siento bien.
I feel fine. Number three is that there will be much more dropping of the object pronoun in Brazilian Portuguese than in Spanish. And so if you are asking someone, we'll have an example of Glauber asking someone if they've seen a certain movie. And in Portuguese, the literal translation would be, yes, I saw. And in Spanish and English, you always have to have that pronoun. I saw, or the object, I saw it, for example. But in Portuguese, you can get away with that. And you often hear Brazilians making the exact opposite mistake when you ask them, you know, did you like a certain food? And they'll say, yes, I liked, or he liked, without including that object. But you can get away with that in Portuguese, as you'll see.
Você viu esse filme? Sim, eu vi.
¿Viste esa película? Sí, la vi.
Did you see that film? Yes, I saw it.
Você compraria essa casa? Não, eu não compraria.
¿Comprarías esa casa? No, no la compraría.
Would you buy that house? No, I wouldn't buy it. All right, and one thing for number 4, something you might have picked up from the last example is that Brazilians will often respond to a yes or no question by conjugating that verb rather than saying yes. In fact, some think that Americans are being very curt or not very rude, but rude when they just respond to a question with sim or no. It's more proper to say, yes, I saw it, or yes, I went there. Including that in addition to the yes or no.
Foi ele que disse isso? Sim, foi ele.
¿Fue él quien dijo eso? Sí.
Was it him that said that? Yes.
Você gosta de queijo? Não, eu não gosto.
¿Te gusta el queso? No.
Do you like cheese? No. Number 5, and this is going to be a big relief to us simple-minded English-speaking folks, but the verb gostar, which is to like, and in Spanish that's the correlate is gustar. It's a direct verb in Portuguese versus being an indirect verb in Spanish. If you've learned Spanish, you know that if you want to say that you liked something, that gustar has to agree with what you are liking and not the person who's saying it. So if you like beans, you say, me gustan frijoles. But in Portuguese, you would say, eu gosto de feijão. Right? And it conforms with the person who is speaking it rather than the object. So we call that a direct verb, and these examples will help.
Eles gostam de jogar futebol.
¿Les gusta jugar fútbol?
They like to play soccer.
Eu gostaria de viajar ao Brasil.
Me gustaría viajar a Brasil.
I would like to travel to Brazil. Okay, and along the same lines with number 5, how gostar was so much easier, Portuguese is filled with a lot of these verbs that are reflexive in Spanish, but that in Portuguese they're once again direct, and they'll be actually easier for English speakers. These are a lot of the verbs that have to do with I think of them as, preparing for your morning, like getting out of bed, brushing your teeth, showering. All those in Spanish are typically reflexive, right? But in Portuguese, they're direct, and it's much easier to think of them as so.
Eu levantei muito cedo.
Me levanté muy temprano.
I woke up very early.
Ela esqueceu a resposta.
Se le olvidó la respuesta.
She forgot the answer.
Senta aqui.
Siéntate.
Sit down. So you can see, for example, with eu levantei versus me levantei, it's in Portuguese you're literally saying just I rose very early, whereas in Spanish you're saying I rose myself up. You're having to direct the action back on yourself when you're saying these verbs, which in Portuguese doesn't exist and is a lot easier. Okay, number 7, I'll run through a quick explanation, but it's going to be a little easier just to see the examples. So, indirect object pronouns, both in Spanish and in Portuguese, go before a single verb in a sentence. Some examples of that to make it easier to visualize.
Carlota me disse a verdade.
Carlota me dijo la verdad.
Carlota told me the truth.
Martim nos deu o livro.
Martín nos dio el libro.
Martin gave us the book. So those are examples where you just have a single verb within a sentence. But if you have 2 verbs, for example in the English sentence, I am going to do something, you have both to go and to do. In Spanish, if you have a string like this, you would put the indirect object pronoun either before both of those verbs together or after, as you'll see in a second. However, Brazilian Portuguese almost exclusively sticks that indirect object pronoun right in the middle, which isn't a huge difference, but you're going to hear it spoken, and it'll make sense once you see these examples here. And let's start with this one.
Eles querem te mandar uma carta.
Ellos quieren mandarte una carta.
They want to send a letter to you.
Maria vai me dizer a verdade.
María me va a decir la verdad.
Maria is going to tell me the truth. Tip number 8 involves the single letter a, or the a, in sentences in Portuguese. First of all, in Spanish, you know that if you are performing an action or doing something to someone, you have to do the action a someone. The personal a is what you learn in Spanish classes. That's gone in Portuguese. And also the a after a phrase like I'm going to do something, yo voy a hacer algo. The a there is gone. So in Portuguese it's simply I'm going and then directly into the verb, unlike in Spanish which needs that a. And so an example of losing the personal a is
Ela contratou ele.
Ella contrató a él.
she hired him. And then this is an example of losing the a after the going to do something.
Eu vou fazer o mesmo.
Voy a hacer lo mismo.
I'm going to do the same thing. And then together, getting really fancy here, losing both the personal a and losing the a after irá.
Eles vão buscar o secretário.
Ellos van a buscar al secretario.
They're going to look for the secretary. And so you can see in that final example, you lose that a, and instead of saying they're going to look for to the secretary, which is the literal translation in Spanish, it's much more, Portuguese is much more similar to English in that sense. Glauber is eating a bagel, so in the meantime, I'll work through the explanation of our 9th tip, which is that Brazilians, if you haven't noticed, love articles. This specific example, or the examples I'll show here, you're going to see articles before names. So if you're referring to someone who you're not talking to, like my wife Lauren, I would say, yeah, the Lauren is still at home or something. Literally calling a person the Zitelli, the Glauber, the Gavin. I don't know if you remember, but when you texted me this morning to try to get in the building, you asked if, or when you texted me to get her number, you asked if you could get the Zitelli's number.
Oh, é?
Just like the possessive pronoun thing, you know.
Oh, let me check.
That's funny. Does it tell his number?
Oh, does it? No, I forgot that you don't use the before names.
Right, because Brazilians love articles. They just love it. You'll also see articles before possessive pronouns. So if you're saying, this is my book, you would say in Portuguese literally, this is my book, o meu livro. And that sounds super weird to English speakers, and this is something that doesn't really exist in Spanish. But it'll come to you quicker than you think once you start kind of saying these phrases. So to demonstrate the articles before names to begin.
A Laura está cansada.
Laura está cansada.
Laura's tired. And then with this one you're going to see now the article before possessive pronouns.
A Laura é a minha amiga.
Laura es mi amiga.
Laura is my friend.
Eu vou dar o meu relógio ao Marcelo.
Le voy a dar mi reloj a Marcelo.
I'm going to give my watch to Marcelo. And so you heard Glauber say, literally, the actual translation is, I'm going to give my watch to the Marcelo. Again, Brazilians they love those articles. Tip number 10 has to do with the present perfect, and instead of trying to describe to you how it works because it's a little scary, we're just going to go through a couple examples and then talk about it retrospectively.
Você já comeu comida japonesa?
¿Has comido comida japonesa?
Have you ever eaten Japanese food? And so with this example, literally what Zitelli and I are saying, both in Spanish and in English, are, have you ever eaten Japanese food? In Portuguese, it has the same sense of, like, any time in the past have you ever eaten it. But instead, it's conjugated in the preterite. So you heard Glauber say já comeu, which literally means did you already eat Japanese food in English. And so the present perfect, or the preterite has this sense of present perfect in Portuguese.
Ainda não vi esse filme.
Todavía no he visto esa película.
I still haven't seen that movie. And so you can see again, Zitelli and I are saying we haven't seen that movie, but Glauber says that he didn't see that movie. And so while it says didn't see in Portuguese, what is meant is that he hasn't seen it at any time in the past. Finally, tip number 11 has to do with a subject that we English speakers hate about Spanish and Portuguese is a subjunctive. And unfortunately, the bad news is that if you thought Spanish was bad with subjunctive, there's even more in Portuguese. And specifically, this tip has to do with future subjunctive, which is alive and well in Brazilian Portuguese. And it's formed from the stem of the third person plural, the preterite form. That's the technical stuff. You can read about that anywhere else online. Just so that you're aware though, and when you hear this tense, it's for when an event in the future might happen, or you hope it happens, but it hasn't happened yet and you're wondering if it will. It's not something you necessarily have to master, but again, you will hear that verb tense and just be aware.
Se você quiser, eu posso tirar uma foto.
Si quieres, puedo tomar una foto.
If you want, I can take a photo.
Eu vou tomar uma cerveja se a gente for jantar.
Voy a tomar una cerveza si vamos a cenar.
I'm gonna drink a beer if we go out to eat.
Normally, when people is going home or something like that, hey, what? Não esquece, viu? And the person is going to ask, what? And you say, se você espirrar, saúde.
Future subjunctive right there.
Se você espirrar, yeah, that's right.
Wow. Perfect. So that wraps it up for these 11 grammar tips. I'm sure that was unbelievably fast, and I know that there were very few examples there, but again, this was kind of to give you an idea of what to watch for. And please go check out any of these other sites online. I listed a couple book resources that I use down below as well. Tá Falado specifically is a great blog site from the University of Texas that talks about a lot of these themes, and I borrowed a few examples from them. But yeah, I think it's a good idea to kind of have some idea of what you need to look for or what to expect, and these are the 11 biggest things that I've come across when moving from Spanish to Portuguese. So keep tuned. Hopefully we'll post a video about word differences or false cognates sometime in the future, which will be a lot easier, I think, than this very difficult grammar post.
Yeah, and it's funny.
Yeah, it'll be good too. So yeah, until next time. See ya.
See ya.
Hasta pronto.